this morning's or afternoon's call from ITCC member meeting. Just a few notes. If you have any questions, we'll have a question and answer session with our presenter, as well as there's a chat feature, so you can certainly send any questions that way. We'll make sure that they're asked. Additionally, just from an ITCC perspective, we did also just send out our call for submissions for Innovation Award for 2017. So please take a look at that email, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. With that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our presenter for the day, Joe McClary. Joe.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be with you today, and it's nice to be here with the IT Certification Council. I want to thank Clyde Seepersod, who invited me to come in today to share with you some of the top guidelines for developing training that supports the achievement of accreditation. I know many of you are in the certification business. I have a history with IT certification. I've gotten the Microsoft certifications, or at least a good number of them, and I've gotten the A+ many years ago. I've kind of gone the way of kind of gotten out of the technology business, more in the management and education side of things. But I always enjoyed the IT side, and do come to the table today with some familiarity with some of the things that you do, and I hope that we will have some substantive things that are relevant to you today. Just to give you a little bit of a context for who we are and what we do, it'll take just a moment, but we are the International Association for Continuing Education and Training, and essentially our broad mission or goal is to advance the global workforce by providing the standard framework for quality learning and development through accreditation. Essentially what that means is that we have an accreditation program that evaluates the instructional design and delivery of an education provider and all their processes that go into the instructional design and delivery of a learning event. You might call that a course, you might call that a program, you may call that a symposium. We call those learning events for uniform nomenclature. And we have an ANSI, the American National Standards Institute has accredited our standard for continuing education and training, been through that rigorous process, and essentially that's what we do. We've had over 1,000 different providers come to IACET to seek accreditation for their providership, for their educational organization. We then examine their documentation to ensure that they meet the standard that we impose. Once they meet that standard, then they can offer CEUs or IACET accredited CEUs. Back in '68, that would be 1968, IACET coined the term CEU, as I'm sure many of you have heard that before. While most of you can offer quote-unquote CEUs, the big question is what is behind the CEU, the continuing education unit. And we, again, provide the ANSI accredited standard that sits behind that continuing education unit. So that we are into a number of other things I'll just go through very, very quickly. We are developing a system or a standard for competency-based education. Right now our standard is based on clock hours, CEUs. So it really, students who go through an educational regimen should have to spend so much seat time to be able to get their credit. Whereas opposed, as most of you know, especially in the IT industry, there's a stronger focus on competency for efficiency. Companies today do not want to pay someone to sit and learn something for 10 hours if they already can master it in one. Vice versa, they don't want to spend or pay for 10 hours if the person's going to take 20 to have to learn it. Maybe they need to invest for that individual. So competency-based education is very big, and we're in the process of developing a standard for the competency-based model that can be used in that type of education. I'll refer to our website at IACET.org for a lot more of the other things, but let's get right into the content today that we've designed for you now that you know just a little bit about us and where we come from. As I thought about today's presentation, we come back to the root word of really why we're here, and that's certification. You all offer some type of certification. It's the act of making something official, the act of certifying something, official approval to do something professionally or legally. And that puts the onus on you to ensure that what you provide, what you certify, indeed has integrity. It's very easy for people to say, well, I'm going to certify you in this, and somehow miss the whole purpose of what they're after, miss the whole purpose of working through their processes. But what we want to do here today is talk about the things that in an educational program that support the achievement of certification. That means we want to ensure that our education has integrity. We want to ensure that it's going to support that ultimate certification that we depend upon in our society. So let's take a look at our objectives specifically that were given to you before in the description of today's webinar. And let's take a look very quickly and let's fulfill some of our objectives that we have today. First, we're going to identify some instructional design methods that ensure integrity in your learning process. When you offer your learning processes or others offer their learning processes for accreditation. You know, that's another thing as well. What I was thinking, many of you just simply test for competency. You may not offer the education behind the scenes. For example, CompTIA, I'm sure there are many providers that provide boot camps and things like that for CompTIA. CompTIA is not an exclusive provider of all the information on Server Plus, Network Plus, A Plus, so on and so forth. However, perhaps there should be educational standards for those providers that do. I remember very clearly going to a bookstore and buying education that was supposed to help me with A+, and the design was terrible. Now, this was many, many, many years ago. But at the same time, I do remember that the instructional design of the education that went along with that certification that was meant to educate me toward it was, frankly, less than it could have been. So let's take a look at the objectives or some of the instructional design methods that can ensure integrity. Number one, make identifying the learner identity a priority. So many times what you do may be regulated. I'm not sure, especially if we have healthcare and safety providers here today, ensuring learner identity. It's often puzzling to me that, especially when people sign in, or they'll require students to sign in a classroom, and for distance learning they don't require anything, and they assume that because the student paid with a credit card that their identity has been verified. And we all know that that's not the case. Numerous technologies exist now. You don't have to go to biometrics. There's numerous other technologies that can help ensure the identifying learner identity. I know from years of working with regulatory agencies that this is probably one of their biggest concerns, especially about distance learning programs that underlie accreditation programs. So we'll start there. Number two, let's ensure the completion of an accurate needs analysis and revise, especially for IT-related programs. I remember I used to teach computer science. I taught computer science, and I wrote the curriculum and helped write some of the curriculum for the school district I was in for teacher training. Well, I wrote the school training, and I had the first year that I wrote that, we had mouse training on teaching the students how to use the mouse as a pointing device. Only a year and a half later, I had to rewrite that curriculum to remove that section because we found that spend any time at all teaching the students how to use a mouse was essentially moot. Students already knew how to use a mouse. So in this case, ensuring completion of an accurate needs analysis, and that can be expensive as well. It can be very expensive to ensure the completion of an accurate needs analysis. I'm sure some of you probably use professional testing companies to do that. Make sure that it's done on a regular basis, and make sure that it is indeed valid and that you spend the time, because if you don't, it could affect every other thing that you do in your educational program. You're going to want to develop outcomes and objectives from the needs analysis. Your needs analysis feeds the outcomes that you produce. And then, so you're going to want to require the learner to do something measurable. So if you're using a professional testing company, this is probably not that big of a deal. But you're going to want, when you create your objectives, you're going to want to avoid things like the student will understand the basics of how a network operates. Those are very, very broad. They're not measurable. One of my favorite is that the learner would appreciate how to set up a 10 base T, 100 base T, 1,000 base T network. Appreciate. How do we measure that the student will appreciate or grasp? Those are very, very vague terms, and it's frankly one of the #1 things that we can identify an amateur educator with is by when they pose inappropriate or immeasurable objectives in their learning design documents. The second thing we would talk about is use Bloom's taxonomy for ensuring the appropriate rigor is implemented. So often we see that continuing education programs for professionals is nothing more than a repeat of maybe the pre-license or qualifying education. As you all know, as people mature in their careers and their profession, they grow, they advance, and while sometimes, a rehash of review material is not a bad thing to do, it should be recognized that a student or a learner in continuing education should be able to answer some slightly more advanced questions, perhaps over the same objectives. And you can, if you're not familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, just Google that, and you will have a plethora of resources at your disposal to be able to implement that in your program. We're going to ensure outcomes are appropriately measured with assessment. Match the verbs and the outcome with the assessment when possible. What that means, if one of our biggest violations that we see at IACET and the thousands of providers that we accredit is that they'll create a document and they'll say, explain how to distinguish from the API layer in a TCP/IP protocol or something similar to that. And so when a student's asked to explain, or the objective calls for a student to, quote, explain, well then right there you're going to have the student write something in some type of open-ended question, short essay, long essay, and oftentimes the provider has no intention of grading such. The provider is probably, or perhaps the testing provider is dependent upon things that, for example, that I'm sorry, we got some feedback from some other folks on the line. I apologize, but we often see that when providers ask the student to explain, they have no intention to asking the student to explain something on the exam. That's a real issue. So you're going to want to stick to measurable objectives that you'll actually measure against in the assessment. So if you're going to ask a student to define the layers of TCP/IP protocol, then they're going to have to define that or identify that in the assessment. So make sure that your objectives, your outcomes match what you're doing in the assessment. And finally, evaluate the programs regularly. Make improvement a part of the educational culture. We can usually walk into a provider of education and find out very quickly within the first few minutes if they really have a culture of improvement in their programs. If we tell them or we ask them, have you implemented a framework like Kirkpatrick's model? And Kirkpatrick's isn't the perfect model, but it's a great general framework for training evaluation. If I could have hands, we don't have that capability here, but if we could have hands, I'd love to see how many of you are familiar with Kirkpatrick and implement something that in the evaluation. If you're not, let me just quickly give you the 4 levels of Kirkpatrick and their training evaluation, because essentially this is a big part of how organizations can evaluate their training. So here are the 4 levels. The first level in your program or in your learning event evaluation, you're going to want to find to what degree participants react favorably to the learning event. Did you enjoy it? What did you like about it? What didn't you like about it? That's a level 1 reaction, and you can have questions to measure level 1 quite easily in in your evaluations. Number two, you want to know to what degree the participants acquired the intended skill or skills. In other words, did they felt like they learned? Did they learn anything from the course? Were the skills and the attitudes, to what degree did they achieve the objectives? Did they pass the tests? Were they able to achieve what was stated? So that's a measure. Level 3 would constitute to the degree which participants apply what they learned during training back on their job. Now this is a very difficult one to measure. So in your evaluation programs, there's a couple ways you can do this. Number one, the larger the organization that you're in, the higher the stakes, the more formal you're going to want to be at a level 3. So in other words, you might want to do a study based upon different implementations of different types of training, and you can measure the results of that by isolating those variables back on the job and then measure that way. That's an expensive, hard way to do it, but it's also a quality way to do it. We would call that a formal evaluation process to measure if they could apply what they learned back on the job. There's another way to do that that's far less expensive, but it's not quite as meaningful, and that's just to ask the student, ask the learner, did what you learn help you on your job? Yes or no, or to what degree? We would call that an informal approach, but nevertheless it's less expensive and it does allow you at least some tangible means to evaluate the courses that you provided. And then we have level 4. This is the most difficult to isolate and measure, and that's the degree the targeted outcomes occur as a result of the learning event and subsequent reinforcement. And oftentimes this requires some type of external study, some type of analysis beyond just asking the student. This is one of the most difficult ones to measure and isolate, but nevertheless there's methods for doing that go beyond the scope of this particular presentation. If you want more information on Kirkpatrick, you can go to kirkpatrickpartners.com, and they have some great resources there that could help you with that. Now let's look at learning management system pitfalls. Out of the thousands of courses I've reviewed over my career, here are some of the big learning management system pitfalls in regulatory compliance and how to avoid them. Let's take a quick look. Learning management systems that don't support important administrative functions or a flexible API to fill needed gaps with ancillary applications and processes. What essentially we mean by this is that the LMSs essentially silo your data and keep you from integrating that data or keeping you from doing what you need to do through separate applications that may fill administrative gaps or educational gaps or whatever that may be. A lot could be said about this item. It's a very big deal in that you have a lot of administrative processes that won't integrate with your LMS. LMSs that don't allow for big data research processes, and we all know the importance of big data as we continue in our society to collect all the information. It will be amazing to have a focus on how you can search that data and joining databases, creating meaningful, deep, wide data mines that you can extrapolate meaningful information from. We've all seen the surge in academic institutions that are offering data science degrees or data science masters or things like that. And so for some of the things that the LMS might not do to accomplish that, it's keeping the delivery and evaluation system siloed, for example. If I were to ask most providers of education, how many of you have a delivery system and then you have an evaluation system that's separate? Some of the providers we use, many of them use SurveyMonkey, for example. Well, SurveyMonkey might be a nice way to collect an evaluation, but it doesn't integrate anything back to the learning management system unless you go through a manual process to do that. So essentially, does your LMS allow for integration to other databases and developing that mind so you can get a much better accurate picture of many, many different facets of your education and how students are reacting as they navigate through it. So failure to another LMS pitfall is a failure to make discrete changes in how the course is offered based upon requirements of a certain regulatory body. So for example, you'll go to one particular state if you're offering your education for credit, and the state will say, well, we want you to do X, Y, or Z, and I'll give you an example of that. Most providers, say in the real estate industry, if you were offering professional real estate education, you would offer a course, and then you would go to the state of Texas, only state in the union that does what I'm about to tell you. And to ensure student identity, there again, there's a student identity issue. To ensure student identity, the state of Texas makes random questions pop up in the learning event that require validation. So you might be taking the course, and then all of a sudden at a random time pop, enter the last 4 digits of your social, enter the last 4 digits of the credit card, what was your mother's maiden name. And if you don't fill in that product, if you don't fill in that field, then the system will essentially lock you out until you call support and engage back and confirm identity. Lots of problems with that, and I'm not going to talk about the merit of that or the lack of merit in that particular procedure, but the bottom line is some of these groups will require you to do things differently in one state than you might have to do in another. So having that ability to tweak your delivery, tweak the administrative processes through that. Some states, some places might require you, for example, to have 3 different versions of a final exam, while others may ask you to simply have a meaningful bank that measures and extrapolates on each of the objectives or measures each of the objectives. So sometimes those things having a flexible LMS can help you in achieving that. Again, we're going back to the integration ability of an LMS, inability to get information out or into the system efficiently, and finally, inability to structure assessment and question bank technology correctly. You'd be surprised about how many LMSs out there, and I'll give you an example. There is one provider I'm thinking of that's relatively large. They're out there, and they do not have a meaningful assessment methodology for this learning management system that they're marketing to accreditation and certification entities. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Let me bring up that particular slide just for a moment. Let me give you an example of this. When we look at an assessment, assessment is more than just giving students a 10-question quiz. That's one of my observations, that amateur educators will often say, well, you've just had a unit of instruction, let's give you 10 questions. Why 10? Why 20? The number of questions in an assessment should be directly related to the outcomes. And then you have to make some statistical determination of how many questions they need to ask before you can actually measure, engage competency or mastery of that particular outcome. So sometimes some of the LMSs, one of the ones that I was telling you about, a big one out on the market today, they allow you to throw questions into a bank. So let's say you have 10 objectives. You can throw 30 questions into the bank, and then you're going to get 30 random questions out of the bank, and you're going to get, say there's 10 questions, you have 30 in the bank, and then you're going to get 10 random questions from the bank. Now, if that sounds good to you, we're missing something, because essentially when you choose 10 random questions, it doesn't mean that those 10 random questions are associated with each of the learning assessment outcomes. So for example, what would be needed is something like this. On your screen in front of you there, you see the learner assessment. You have the first question pulled at random from outcome A. And in the bank, you see that outcome A has 3 questions, but one of those questions will be asked. One of those questions over each outcome will have to be asked. The same would be with outcome B. You would have 3 questions, and you would be surprised how many learning management systems do not do this, which essentially means that essentially, this means that we have organizations that are assessing, and they're not covering or assessing all the outcomes that they're supposed to measure learning. So that's an important characteristic. Let's go back for just a moment, and we will look at, we finished up our LMS list. Let's go to a few other issues. Let's talk about time and competency. So we see that we're here to examine issues with seat time versus competency and how to maintain the integrity in your educational programming. And what we mean by that is sometimes you're forced, sometimes state statute or legislation requires you to have a particular time, an amount of time that you have to educate a student for in order for them to get credit, i.e., for example, our continuing education units. Accreditation, you have to spend X amount of time in a course. So how does this, I think this is especially relevant for our IT certifications. And so here's some consideration in regard to that. Is formal education required prior to testing for the credential? So in other words, let's say that somebody's been working with network equipment their whole entire life, never taken a class, but they've read a book. Can they go sit for a plus? The answer is yes. There's no formal education that's required for that. So there's no need for some type of time requirement. However, if you sit for a license or a professional license or a professional certification, there may be a prerequisite for the candidate to spend X amount of time in a particular course. So how are you going to do that? How are you going to ensure that that student spends the appropriate amount of time in the and I'm primarily talking here about a distance learning course. We know if they come to class and they sit there that they'll be there for that long. But if they're in a distance learning environment, how are you going to enforce that? There are lots of ways to do it. Many go beyond the scope of our presentation today. But in some environments, seat time is legislatively mandatory. You need to ensure that you understand, do not assume you are working in a competency model when you're not. So in other words, many times you'll see, for example, well, the state requires or the government requires X amount of education for a particular topic. Well, that's legislatively mandatory, meaning you better plan and have some type of enforcement for the student to spend the appropriate amount of time in the course, because it's legislatively mandated. Do not assume that you can say, well, the student passed the test, so why should they have to spend the rest of the time in there? You will often find that your education will crash and burn if you make that assumption incorrectly and don't work with your regulatory agencies to ensure timing issues are addressed. Now here's another big one. Does anyone want or expect a government to adequately define competency in a field? Most of the time, competency is defined in a field by professional associations that actually know what they're talking about. I've worked with state legislators. I've passed legislation, some of the most meaningful legislation for education reform for real estate agents in the state of Kentucky, where I live. And I will tell you that the vast majority of legislators do not understand your issues. They do not understand anything about competency, and they have to leave it to professional associations, or at least should. When the government gets into trying to define competency, usually they don't know how to do it, so they'll just define hours of education and not actually define outcomes. In other places, they'll leave it to the trade associations or the professional associations to help define that competency, and rightly so. If the focus is on competency, considering formatting education-friendly microlearning, now keep this in mind. Most of you have all been to lynda.com. I think that's an outstanding service. I use it all the time. I've saved a fortune over going to classes. So for example, I did have a little hobby in video editing, and I really didn't need a whole day's class, and I wasn't going to pay for an entire day's class or training program on Adobe Premiere, for example. So what I did, because I had some experience already with it in the past, and my hobby kind of led me to have some pretty great fundamental knowledge. there were gaps. So I identified what those gaps were, and I went immediately to lynda.com, and I only took the education that was relevant to me. And essentially that boils down to a great new trend in continuing education and training, which is the explosion of microlearning and being able to sit and learn what you need to learn in a very short amount of time, and then you can move on to apply that knowledge immediately without having to go through some additional formal, longer, unnecessary, wasteful type training. So for lots of data out there on microlearning. If I were in the IT certification business and preparing any education, I would be most certainly reusing that in some format friendly and compatible to a microlearning environment. Finally, ensure competency checks rigorous enough to actually measure the competency. Again, when a student, can a student, because they pass a 25-question final exam, really be competent to sit the A+ exam or Microsoft exam? What is competency? Ensure that you have a statistical analysis of what competency is, so you can ensure a rigorous measure to adequately gauge what competency is. And finally, here's the thing. This is in closing. We have this objective deals with how to improve your assessments. We just talked about the need for assessments, talked about the need to measure and accurately verify what you're certifying through that assessment. Here are some, when we talk about validity and reliability, every assessment that you offer has a validity and reliability concerns. Validity, essentially, as you probably know, validity is the assessment valid to actually measure what it says it's going to measure. And then you have reliability, meaning, well, if we ask this question over time, is it a reliable way? Is it a reliable way? Will the results be repeated over time over different groups? So that's a very, very simple explanation of validity and reliability. We could go probably a whole day on a seminar at least on validity and reliability issues of assessments. But let me give you some very simple tips for when you design your assessments, how to improve validity and reliability. Number one, your outcomes should be clear and defined in writing. Seems self-explanatory, so we're not going to spend much time on that one. Base the number of questions in the instrument on the number of outcomes. Again, one of the questions that we receive most in the accreditation of education business is, how many questions in the quiz do you expect? And as soon as we hear that question, we know that the educator is an amateur, because essentially the number of questions should be based on the number of outcomes you're trying to measure. Finally, increase the number of questions, measuring each outcome to improve the reliability. Write assessment items that focus on the application of knowledge rather than just the comprehension. This goes back to Bloom's taxonomy. If you go to higher levels of Bloom's, and you know, Benjamin Bloom found that most assessment questions in his study back in the 50s are what we call the knowledge and comprehension level, which means that most quizzes and tests essentially embrace a very simple format of measuring what the student will know, if the student can define, if the student can list. Whereas if you want to improve validity and reliability, go a little higher on that to help ensure that the learning has some depth. Ask the student if they can compare and contrast. Ask the student if they know how to build. Ask the student if they can troubleshoot. Ask the student if they can list multiple options for a solution. Those are all higher cognitive activities that go along with higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, so that would be helpful. Second, have stakeholders or the appropriate sample audience review the assessment. I've sat through this process in the real estate industry where the professional testing companies will fly experts in from all over the country, and they will sit and they will review exam questions to ensure that the stakeholders can review that and ensure there's no dissonance in the questions in regard to how they're viewed by professionals in that industry. And finally, use an analysis of the results to formatively improve. If you're going to be writing test questions and you're administering those questions, essentially there should be a regular review of those questions in your learning management system, and you should see which students are missing the most questions. If you have questions with a higher distribution of misses, there may be an issue with that question. So those are types of things that you'll want to do on a regular basis to improve the integrity of what you're measuring. Because there again, when it comes back to what you're doing, you are trying to create education where people certify. And I understand that there's a gray line between perhaps the test that a student has to take and perhaps the education that they do before it. Nevertheless, the purpose of today's presentation was to give you some of the best practices for instructional design of education that supports certification. I hope to some degree that's been useful. At this juncture, I'd love to take any questions that you may have, and thank you again for the opportunity to talk to you today.
Thanks, Joe. Any questions from the group? I guess you covered it all, Joe. There's no more questions.
Well, that's not something I feel bad about. Usually, what I will tell you, the most valuable thing I've ever learned in my career when teaching in a classroom or online is wait time. And oftentimes it just takes a few minutes for people to think through the questions, or perhaps this wasn't maybe it's generated a lot of questions. Regardless, if it did, and I'm sure some of you will think of some things after this day. If you want to take down my number and my email address here, I'd be happy to interface with any of you. If you're interested in having your organization that provides education, if you're interested in benchmarking your programs against a quality standard, please consider IACET for that. And we'd love to work with you in that capacity if that's what you need. Otherwise, again, we really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everyone, for participating on today's call. As a reminder, we'll make sure that everyone has a copy of the presentation along with Joe's contact information if you do have any questions. Thank you again for joining today, and have a good rest of the day.